The sun was just beginning to rise over the sleepy streets of Glendale, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. The town's rhythm was slow and familiar. Morning joggers passed by with earbuds firmly in place, and shop owners flipped signs from closed to open while greeting their regulars. At the corner of 5th and Main, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the small cafe, Joe's Corner, where locals gathered for their daily dose of caffeine and small talk. Michael Carter sat at his usual table outside the cafe, sipping his medium roast coffee with measured ease. In his late 30s, Michael's calm demeanor and confident posture often masked the invisible challenge he faced every day: blindness. A tragic car accident years ago had robbed him of his sight, but not his determination. By his side, as always, was Zeus, his German Shepherd guide dog. Zeus wasn't just any service dog. He carried a quiet, commanding presence, his muscular frame and alert eyes hinting at a past that went beyond guiding Michael through busy sidewalks. Zeus had once been a K-9 officer, trained to detect danger, neutralize threats, and protect with precision. After retiring from the force due to an injury, he was paired with Michael through a specialized program for visually impaired individuals. From the moment they met, Zeus had been more than a guide. He was Michael's protector, his anchor, and his closest companion. Together, they navigated a world that was often unforgiving to vulnerability. The morning felt ordinary, with its usual buzz of traffic and chatter. Michael ran his hand along Zeus's smooth coat as he leaned back in his chair, soaking in the ambient sounds of Glendale. For a moment, everything seemed as peaceful as the serene blue sky above. But peace, as Michael knew, could be deceptive. The faint rumble of motorcycle engines broke through the hum of conversations, growing louder with each passing second. Heads turned as 3 riders pulled into a parking spot across the street. The roar of their engines echoed off the buildings, drawing attention like a firework in a quiet night. Dressed in black leather jackets adorned with bold patches and skull motifs, the trio dismounted with a swagger that demanded recognition. At the center was Chuck, a broad-shouldered man with a cocky grin that never seemed to leave his face. His loud, boisterous laugh carried across the cafe patio as he gestured animatedly to his 2 friends. Chuck wasn't a stranger to making scenes. He thrived on being the center of attention, often at the expense of others. His reputation in Glendale was as loud as his Harley, known for his pranks that always walked the line between humor and outright cruelty. His friends, Eddie and Rob, weren't much different. Together, they thrived on a toxic cocktail of bravado and mischief, finding amusement in their dominance over quieter spaces like Joe's Corner. As the trio strolled onto the cafe patio, their boots clunking against the pavement, Chuck's sharp eyes fell on Zeus and Michael. He nudged Eddie, nodding toward the German Shepherd. "Check out that beast," Chuck said, his voice dripping with exaggerated amusement. "Looks like someone brought a wolf to breakfast." Zeus, always on high alert, lifted his head slightly. His keen instincts had already registered the group as potential trouble, and his eyes tracked Chuck's every move. Michael, oblivious to the approaching trio, reached out to Zeus as a gesture of reassurance. "You're quiet this morning," he murmured softly. Chuck, however, was not quiet. He strode closer, his presence as commanding as the patch on his jacket that read Alpha Dogs. His friends followed behind, exchanging low chuckles as they took stock of the scene. Stopping a few feet away, Chuck tilted his head and smirked. "That's a big dog you got there," he said, loud enough for Michael to hear. Michael, accustomed to comments about Zeus's size, responded with his usual polite tone. "He's a German Shepherd, loyal and protective." Chuck's grin widened, and he crouched slightly, as if studying Zeus. "Protective, huh? What's he gonna do? Bark me to death?" His friends laughed, though their laughter felt forced, as if they too weren't entirely comfortable with Chuck's antics. Zeus didn't move, his focus unbroken. There was something about Chuck's exaggerated gestures and mocking tone that kept the dog on edge. Michael, sensing Zeus's unusual tension, placed a steady hand on his collar. "Is something wrong?" he asked quietly, more to Zeus than to the man in front of him. The question seemed to amuse Chuck. "Wrong? Nah, just making friends," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. But his smirk betrayed his real intentions. He reached out suddenly, his hand hovering just inches from Zeus's snout, testing the animal's reaction. Zeus let out a low growl, a sound that wasn't loud but carried a warning weight. Chuck froze briefly, startled by the sound, but quickly recovered, laughing as though it had been a joke. "Easy, big guy," he said, his tone lighter, but still condescending. He turned back to his friends. "Guess he doesn't like making new friends." The tension thickened, unnoticed by most patrons who remained absorbed in their lattes and morning conversations. But to Zeus, the threat wasn't just a joke, it was real. His years of training had taught him to distinguish between harmless interactions and potential danger, and Chuck's behavior was beginning to cross a line. Michael tightened his grip on Zeus's leash, his calm demeanor masking a growing unease. "If you don't mind," he said firmly, "we'd like to enjoy our morning in peace." Chuck chuckled again, but this time there was an edge of frustration in his laugh. He wasn't used to being dismissed so easily, especially not in front of an audience. His eyes darted toward Zeus, then back to Michael, a spark of mischief flickering in his expression. "Relax, man," Chuck said, stepping back slightly. "We're just having some fun." But the grin on his face hinted at a different kind of fun, the kind that was about to push the boundaries of patience and test the loyalty of one extraordinary dog. Chuck leaned back on his heels, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, and shot Michael a smug smile. His two friends stood close, their awkward chuckles fading as they exchanged wary glances. Eddie nudged Rob, whispering something that went unheard, but Rob shook his head, silently urging Eddie to stay quiet. The German Shepherd's unwavering gaze was enough to make anyone think twice, but Chuck wasn't anyone. He thrived on attention and prided himself on pushing boundaries, especially when the spotlight was on him. Zeus didn't break eye contact with Chuck. His training had taught him to measure threats, and everything about the man's stance, his sharp movements, his loud voice, and his dismissive demeanor triggered the instincts of a dog who had once stood between danger and innocent lives. Zeus's growl remained low, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention, but it was enough for Michael to pick up on. He leaned forward slightly, his hand brushing along the smooth fur at the nape of Zeus's neck. "Zeus, easy," Michael murmured under his breath. It wasn't the first time Zeus had sensed something Michael couldn't. The dog's instincts were sharper than ever, a testament to his years as a K-9 officer. Though Michael couldn't see the tension in Zeus's body, he felt it through the leash, a subtle but firm pull, as if the dog was ready to step in at a moment's notice. Chuck noticed the subtle exchange and grinned. "Oh, he's protective, all right. Guess I can't blame him for doing his job," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Then he tilted his head, his grin widening into something that felt more like a challenge. "But what happens if someone tests him?" Michael's expression hardened. He'd dealt with people like Chuck before, people who couldn't resist the urge to poke at vulnerabilities they didn't understand. "I'd recommend you don't," Michael replied evenly, his voice steady but firm. He wasn't one to invite conflict, but he also wasn't one to back down when it came to Zeus. The cafe patio grew quieter as more people began to notice the interaction. A few patrons exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't seen anything. One woman, seated 2 tables away, kept her phone angled discreetly toward the scene, her screen glowing as she recorded the interaction. It wasn't every day that a confrontation like this unfolded in Glendale, and it was clear that curiosity had taken hold. Zeus's ears twitched, his gaze never leaving Chuck, even as the man turned to his friends with an exaggerated shrug. "Relax, it's just a joke," Chuck said, waving his hand dismissively. "No harm done, right?" But Eddie and Rob didn't look convinced. Eddie, a wiry man with a nervous energy about him, nudged Chuck. "Hey man, maybe we should back off," he muttered under his breath. "The dog doesn't look like it's messing around." Chuck rolled his eyes, his bravado undiminished. "Come on, Eddie. It's a dog. What's it gonna do? Write me a ticket." His laugh was loud and grating, and for the first time, it faltered slightly as Zeus's growl deepened. Michael could feel the tension thickening around him like a storm cloud. Though he couldn't see the expressions of the men in front of him, he could sense their energy, brash, uncertain, and teetering on the edge of something more dangerous. He gripped Zeus's leash tighter, his voice firm as he addressed Chuck. "Look, I don't know what kind of point you're trying to prove, but it ends here. Leave us alone." For a moment, Chuck's grin faltered. He glanced around the patio, his gaze lingering on the onlookers. Their stares weren't filled with admiration or amusement anymore. They were edged with disapproval, even unease. Chuck's ego bristled under the weight of their judgment. He wasn't about to let some blind man and his dog make him look weak. "Fine, have it your way," Chuck said, stepping back. His tone was casual, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, a mixture of pride and malice. He turned to his friends and laughed, though it sounded forced. "Come on, let's grab a table." As the trio moved away, Michael exhaled slowly, his grip on Zeus's leash relaxing slightly. "Good boy," he murmured, stroking the dog's fur. Zeus's posture didn't soften, though. His ears remained perked, his eyes darting between Chuck and the rest of the patio. The tension in his muscles told Michael that this wasn't over, not yet. Minutes passed, but the unease lingered like a shadow. Michael sipped his coffee, his senses heightened. He could hear the murmurs of the other patrons, the clink of cups against saucers, and the distant rumble of traffic. But most of all, he could hear the subtle shifts in Zeus's breathing, a steady rhythm punctuated by moments of sharp focus whenever Chuck's voice carried across the patio. Chuck, seated at a nearby table with Eddie and Rob, leaned back in his chair, his boots propped up on the edge of the table. He spoke loudly, his words carrying just enough edge to make it clear they were meant to be overheard. "Some people take life way too seriously," he said, his grin returning as he gestured vaguely in Michael's direction. "It's just a dog, for crying out loud." Eddie shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering toward Zeus. "I don't know, man. That dog's different." Chuck raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Different? Please. It's just like any other mutt. All bark, no bite." Zeus, as if understanding the insult, let out a low growl that sent a ripple of unease through the patio. Michael reached down, his hand resting on Zeus's neck. "Let it go," he said softly, though his words carried a weight that wasn't lost on the patrons around him. Chuck noticed the reaction and grinned. "Let it go?" he repeated mockingly, his voice loud enough to draw more attention. "Sure, I'll let it go, but not before we see what that big guy's really made of." The stage was set, and Zeus, ever vigilant, was ready. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, bathing the cafe patio in a warm glow, but the atmosphere remained tense. Chuck lounged at his table, trying to reclaim his air of dominance with exaggerated laughter and a casual attitude. Yet, anyone paying attention could see the cracks in his bravado. His eyes darted toward Michael and Zeus every few moments, as if waiting for an opportunity to strike. Michael could sense the lingering tension. He couldn't see Chuck's smug expression or the way his friends seemed to squirm in their seats, but he could feel Zeus's unease. The dog's posture was rigid, his gaze locked on the bikers. Even the subtle vibrations through the leash told Michael that Zeus was on high alert. Zeus had never been wrong before. Whether it was guiding Michael across a busy intersection or recognizing danger long before it arrived, the dog's instincts were razor-sharp. And now, those instincts told Michael that Chuck wasn't done. The first sign of trouble came when Chuck leaned forward, lowering his voice to Eddie and Rob. "Watch this," he muttered with a grin. The two men exchanged nervous glances, but neither had the nerve to stop him. Chuck stood, stretching dramatically as if he were just loosening up, and began strolling toward Michael's table. Zeus noticed immediately. His body tensed, his ears swiveling forward like radar dishes. His low growl returned, a sound that was more felt than heard, a warning that reverberated through the air. "Relax, big guy," Chuck said as he approached, his tone dripping with false friendliness. "I'm just saying hi." He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his smile widening as he looked down at Michael. "Didn't mean to upset your mutt earlier. Just having a little fun." Michael tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but his tone firm. "Zeus isn't a mutt. And I'd appreciate it if you kept your fun to yourself." Chuck chuckled, the sound hollow. "Fair enough. But, he doesn't look so tough to me." He took a small step closer, testing the waters. Zeus didn't move, but his growl deepened, the sound sharp enough to make a few nearby patrons glance nervously toward the table. "I wouldn't test him if I were you," Michael said evenly, his grip tightening on the leash. He could feel Zeus's muscles coiled like a spring, ready to act if the situation demanded it. Chuck ignored the warning, his grin turning into a smirk. "What's the worst he can do? He's a guide dog, right? Trained to help, not hurt." He leaned down slightly, his eyes meeting Zeus's unflinching gaze. "Bet he doesn't even have it in him to bite." Zeus's growl grew louder, and for the first time, Chuck hesitated. The intensity in the dog's eyes was unsettling, as if Zeus could see through his bravado and into the insecurity underneath. For a moment, Chuck seemed to consider backing off. But then Eddie's voice cut through the tension. "Chuck, man, come on. Let's just go." His tone was pleading, but Chuck ignored him. Instead, he took another step closer, this time bending slightly, as if to pat Zeus on the head. It was a reckless move, one that Zeus registered as an invasion of his space. The dog's lips curled back, revealing sharp teeth in a silent snarl. Michael stood abruptly, his hand raised to stop Chuck. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Step back. Now." Chuck froze, startled by the authority in Michael's voice. For a brief second, he seemed unsure of himself, but the murmurs from the other patrons spurred him on. He couldn't back down now, not with an audience watching. And then, as if to prove a point, Chuck made his move. With a swift motion, he raised his leg and lightly kicked the metal leg of Michael's chair, the sound ringing out sharply across the patio. But the movement startled Zeus, who interpreted it as an act of aggression. The German shepherd surged forward, his bark loud and forceful, the leash straining in Michael's hand. Chuck stumbled back, his cocky grin replaced by wide-eyed shock as Zeus's teeth snapped just inches from his leg. The sheer force of the bark sent a ripple through the crowd, drawing gasps and whispers. "Zeus, down," Michael commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. Zeus immediately obeyed, stepping back to Michael's side, but keeping his eyes locked on Chuck, his body still coiled with tension. Chuck tried to laugh it off, his voice shaky. "Whoa, easy there, boy. I was just joking." "That's not a joke," Michael said sharply, his voice cutting through the chatter around them. "You don't know what you're messing with." Chuck's friends rushed to his side, pulling him back as more people began to gather around the scene. The woman with the phone was now openly recording, and a few others had their phones out, capturing the moment. The tension in the air was electric, the line between caution and chaos razor-thin. "You okay, man?" one of the bystanders asked Michael, stepping forward cautiously. "I'm fine," Michael replied, though his grip on the leash remained firm. "But if he tries that again, he won't be." Chuck, now visibly rattled, tried to salvage his pride. "Relax, everyone," he said, raising his hands. "It was just a little misunderstanding. No harm done." But the murmurs in the crowd told a different story. People weren't buying his excuses. And as Zeus's growl rumbled once more, it was clear that the stakes had just been raised. The conflict had begun, and neither side was backing down. The aftermath of Zeus's defensive bark left the cafe patio buzzing with tension. Chuck's bravado had taken a hit, but the simmering embarrassment on his face hinted that he wasn't done. He muttered something to Eddie and Rob, who both looked uneasy, their glances darting between Chuck and the crowd of onlookers still lingering nearby. Michael, standing tall with Zeus at his side, took a deep breath. He could sense the energy around him, the hushed conversations, the judgmental murmurs aimed at Chuck, and the unrelenting focus of his loyal companion. Zeus, though back in a neutral stance, hadn't stopped monitoring Chuck. His ears twitched with every movement the biker made, ready to spring into action if the situation escalated again. The crowd began to thin as people returned to their tables, though the tension lingered like a cloud that wouldn't dissipate. Michael reached down to scratch behind Zeus's ears, his voice soft but firm. "You did good, buddy. Just stay calm." But calm wasn't on Chuck's agenda. "Unbelievable," Chuck muttered, his voice just loud enough to carry to Michael's table. He turned to his friends, his face twisting into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "All this over a dog. What a joke." Rob, clearly uncomfortable, leaned in and whispered, "Chuck, let it go. The guy's blind." "He's not your problem." Chuck snapped his head toward Rob, his grin vanishing. "Not my problem? He made me look stupid in front of everyone." His voice dropped lower, filled with irritation. "That much snapped at me. People saw it." "You think I'm letting that slide?" Eddie chimed in, trying to keep the peace. "Come on, man. We've had our fun. Let's just hit the road." But Chuck wasn't listening. He was already plotting his next move. Across the patio, Michael sat back down, trying to reclaim the peaceful morning that had been so abruptly shattered. He took a sip of his coffee, his free hand resting on Zeus's leash. The German shepherd sat at attention, his eyes never straying far from the bikers. A voice broke through the uneasy quiet. "Hey, are you okay?" Michael turned his head slightly toward the sound. It was the woman who had been filming earlier, her phone now tucked away in her bag. Her voice was steady, but her concern was evident. "I'm fine, thanks," Michael replied. "Zeus handled it." She nodded, glancing at the bikers as Chuck gestured animatedly to his friends. "That guy doesn't seem like the type to let things go." Michael gave a small, rueful smile. "Yeah, I got that impression." The woman hesitated before adding, "I got the whole thing on video. If you need it, I'm happy to share." Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's thoughtful of you. I appreciate it, but let's hope it doesn't come to that." As the woman returned to her seat, the tension on the patio seemed to ease slightly. But Michael knew it was temporary. Zeus's continued vigilance told him that Chuck wasn't finished. Moments later, the sound of heavy boots clunking against the pavement drew Michael's attention again. Chuck was approaching once more, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets and a smirk plastered on his face. "Hey, man," Chuck called out, his tone deceptively casual. "No hard feelings, right? Just a little misunderstanding earlier." Michael didn't respond immediately. He could feel Zeus's body stiffen beside him, the leash pulling slightly as the dog repositioned himself protectively. "If you're trying to apologize, you've got a funny way of showing it," Michael said evenly. Chuck stopped a few feet away, his grin widening. "Apologize? Nah, I just thought we should clear the air. Didn't mean to upset you or your pet." "Zeus is not a pet," Michael replied sharply. "He's my guide. And if you think you're clearing the air, you're doing a lousy job." Chuck's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "Relax, man. I'm just saying." Before he could finish, Zeus let out a short, sharp bark, cutting him off. The sound was loud enough to make Chuck flinch, and a ripple of tension spread across the patio again. "Zeus, enough," Michael commanded softly. The dog immediately obeyed, though his gaze remained locked on Chuck. Chuck laughed nervously, taking a step back. "Man, that dog's got an attitude." "What, you train him to do that?" Michael's patience was wearing thin. "Zeus doesn't need training to recognize a threat." Chuck's face hardened at the implication. "A threat, huh? You think I'm a threat?" Michael stood, his calm exterior barely masking the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. I don't know what your deal is, but this stops now. Whatever you're trying to prove, I'm not interested. Leave us alone." The firmness in Michael's voice left no room for argument, and for a moment, it seemed like Chuck might back off. But the faint laughter from a nearby table, someone chuckling at his expense, ignited something in him. Chuck's jaw tightened, and he leaned closer. "You got a lot of nerve, blind guy," he hissed. "Walking around like you owned the place with your little watchdog. Maybe someone needs to teach you a lesson." Before Michael could respond, Zeus's growl cut through the air again, louder and more forceful this time. It wasn't a warning anymore, it was a promise. The German shepherd took a step forward, his muscles taut, ready to defend his owner at all costs. Chuck froze, the confidence draining from his face as the reality of Zeus's readiness sank in. His friends, sensing the shift, rushed to his side and pulled him away. "Chuck, enough!" Eddie snapped. "Let's go before you make this worse." Chuck resisted for a moment, his pride warring with his better judgment. But as Zeus's growl rumbled once more, he relented, throwing up his hands in mock surrender. "Fine. Whatever." As the bikers retreated to their table, the tension eased slightly, but the unease lingered. Michael sat back down, his hand resting on Zeus's head. "Good boy," he murmured. But the conflict was far from over. Chuck's bruised ego wouldn't let him walk away for good, and Michael knew they hadn't seen the last of him. The air around Joe's corner grew heavy as the tension that had momentarily settled began to creep back in. Michael could sense it, an unease lingering in the atmosphere, sharpening his instincts as much as it did Zeus's. He couldn't see the expression on Chuck's face, but he could feel the man's presence even from across the patio. Zeus was still tense, his body alert, ears twitching at every sound from the biker's direction. Chuck sat at his table fuming. The earlier humiliation was too much for his fragile ego to handle. Eddie and Rob tried to steer the conversation to other topics, but Chuck's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't about to let a blind man and his dog make him look weak. "He thinks he's untouchable," Chuck muttered, his voice low and bitter. "That dog, he's just bluffing." "Chuck, come on," Eddie said, his tone filled with exasperation. "Let it go. You're already causing a scene." Chuck's eyes narrowed as he glanced toward Michael and Zeus. "A scene? No, I'll show you a scene." Across the patio, Michael leaned toward Zeus and whispered, still on edge, "Huh, buddy." Zeus responded with a quiet huff, his gaze locked on Chuck. Michael's free hand brushed the leash, silently reassuring his companion. Then it happened. Chuck rose from his chair, grabbing a napkin from the table and crumpling it into a ball. He walked slowly toward Michael's table, his posture casual but his intent anything but. The crowd, still wary from earlier, began to notice his movements. Murmurs rippled through the patio as eyes turned toward the brewing confrontation. Zeus shifted immediately, his body taut and ready. A low growl emanated from his chest, warning Chuck with every step he took. Chuck stopped just short of Michael's table, tossing the napkin to the ground with exaggerated indifference. "Hey, thought I'd give you guys a little gift," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You know, to clear the air." Michael straightened in his seat, his face calm but his tone firm. "I don't want anything from you. Walk away, while you still can." Chuck chuckled, ignoring the warning. He glanced down at Zeus, who was now fully focused on him, the growl growing louder. "What's the matter, big guy? You gonna bark me to death?" And then, in a reckless act of arrogance, Chuck raised his boot and nudged the edge of Michael's chair, not hard, but enough to make his intentions clear. It was a taunt, a dare, and Zeus didn't need any more provocation. In a flash, Zeus lunged forward, his bark echoing like a thunderclap. Michael, anticipating the reaction, held firm to the leash, pulling Zeus back just in time to keep him from making contact. The force of the movement sent Chuck stumbling back, his confident smirk replaced by genuine fear. The cafe erupted in a mix of gasps and shouts. Chairs scraped against the ground as patrons moved back, some grabbing their phones to record. Chuck's friends rushed forward, grabbing his arms and pulling him away. "Are you insane?" Eddie hissed. "That dog's not messing around." Chuck, now visibly shaken, tried to recover his composure. "It's just a dog," he muttered, though his voice lacked the conviction it had before. Michael stood slowly, keeping a firm grip on Zeus's leash. "You've crossed the line," he said, his voice steady but cold. "And you're lucky Zeus listens to me, or you'd be in a world of hurt right now." Chuck's mouth opened as if to retort, but no words came out. The weight of the situation had finally sunk in, and for the first time, he seemed to understand the seriousness of his actions. The tension on the patio was palpable as everyone watched Chuck retreat with his friends. Zeus, still on high alert, stayed close to Michael's side, his eyes following Chuck until he disappeared from view. Michael exhaled slowly, reaching down to stroke Zeus's head. "Good boy," he whispered. But even as the immediate threat faded, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Chuck's pride had been bruised too deeply, and people like him didn't let things go so easily. The crowd began to disperse, the murmur of conversations filling the air again. But for Michael and Zeus, the sense of unease remained, lingering like a storm on the horizon. They had weathered the first wave, but the real challenge was still to come. The day dragged on uneasily after the confrontation at Joe's corner. Michael and Zeus walked home together, the familiar rhythm of their steps disrupted by the weight of what had happened. Zeus was unusually tense, his ears constantly swiveling, as if every sound carried a hidden threat. Michael could feel it through the leash, the subtle pull and hesitation that told him his dog's instincts were still on high alert. The distant rumble of motorcycle engines followed them intermittently, each time setting Zeus on edge. Michael couldn't help but wonder if Chuck and his friends were tailing them. It wasn't paranoia. Michael had learned to trust Zeus's instincts more than his own. As they approached Michael's apartment building, Zeus stopped abruptly, his nose lifting to sniff the air. Michael tightened his grip on the leash. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. Zeus didn't respond in his usual way. Instead, he growled low in his throat, his gaze fixed on something unseen. Michael felt his pulse quicken. He knew better than to dismiss Zeus's warnings. "Let's get inside," he said, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. The two entered the building, the air inside heavy with silence. Michael lived in a modest ground-floor apartment, chosen for its accessibility. As they stepped inside, Zeus immediately began his ritual of inspecting the space, his nose working overtime. Normally, this routine would reassure Michael, but tonight, Zeus's movements felt different, urgent, almost frantic. Michael locked the door behind them, bolting it for good measure. He set his cane against the wall and crouched to stroke Zeus's head. "You're still wound up, huh?" he murmured. "What do you know that I don't?" Zeus didn't relax. Instead, he moved to the window, his large frame standing tall as he peered through the blinds. Michael couldn't see what Zeus saw, but the low growl rumbling from the dog's chest told him enough. Then came the sound that made Michael's stomach drop, the faint hum of motorcycle engines. It grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside the building. Michael froze, his mind racing. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he fumbled to unlock it. Zeus moved back to his side, standing between Michael and the door, his body rigid and protective. The knock came seconds later, loud and deliberate. "Hey, blind guy." Chuck's voice called out, muffled but unmistakable. "You gonna come out and play, or do I have to come in there myself?" Zeus barked sharply, the sound echoing through the apartment. Michael's heart pounded as he pressed the phone to his ear, dialing 911. The operator's calm voice greeted him, but his own voice shook as he explained the situation. "There's someone outside my apartment," he said, gripping Zeus's leash tightly. "I think they're trying to intimidate me. My dog's going crazy. We're sending officers to your location now," the operator assured him. "Stay inside and don't engage with them. But Chuck wasn't waiting. The knock turned into pounding, and then the jarring sound of someone jiggling the doorknob. "Open up," Chuck yelled. "Let's see if your dog's as tough as you think he is." Michael stood, his hand on Zeus's collar. "Stay calm," he whispered, though the words were more for himself than the dog. He felt the vibrations in the floor as footsteps moved to the side of the building, circling toward the window. "Come on, man, let's go," a voice, Eddie's, pleaded. "This is going too far." "No," Chuck snapped. "He made me look stupid. He doesn't get to walk away from that." Michael clenched his jaw, fear and frustration surging through him. He couldn't see what was happening, but he could hear enough to know that Chuck wasn't bluffing. Zeus barked again, louder this time, and Michael could feel the dog's muscles taut with anticipation. Then came the sound of glass scraping, the unmistakable noise of someone trying to pry open a window. Zeus bolted toward the sound, barking furiously as Michael struggled to hold him back. "Get away from the window," Michael shouted, his voice cracking under the strain of the moment. There was a pause outside, followed by Chuck's mocking laughter. "What are you going to do, huh? Send your dog after me?" Zeus barked again, the sound sharper and more forceful than ever. Michael's grip on the leash tightened, his mind racing for a plan. He could hear sirens in the distance, help was on the way, but it felt like time was moving in slow motion. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the air. Chuck had knocked over a trash can near the window, and Zeus lunged toward the sound with a force that nearly pulled Michael off balance. "Hold on, boy," Michael said, his voice a mix of reassurance and desperation. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, every second stretching unbearably as he waited for the sirens to draw closer. Outside, Chuck's voice turned venomous. "You think you're safe in there? You think that dog's gonna protect you forever?" But Zeus's barking didn't waver, and neither did Michael's resolve. He stood firm, his hand gripping the leash like a lifeline. "We're not afraid of you," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging around him. The sirens grew louder, the red and blue lights flashing against the walls as they finally arrived. Chuck's voice faltered, replaced by the sound of hurried footsteps retreating into the night. Michael exhaled shakily, his legs nearly giving out as relief washed over him. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. Chuck had gone too far, and he wouldn't stop until he felt he'd won. The flashing red and blue lights painted streaks of urgency across the walls of Michael's apartment. Zeus, still on edge, stood near the door, his eyes locked on the window where Chuck had last been heard. Even as the sirens grew deafeningly close, Zeus's growl remained steady, a low rumble of vigilance that reassured Michael, but also warned of lingering danger. A sharp knock at the door jolted Michael. This time, it was followed by a calm, authoritative voice. "Police. Is anyone inside?" Michael approached the door cautiously, gripping Zeus's leash tightly. "It's me," he called out. "Michael Carter. I'm with my dog, Zeus." "We're here to help, Mr. Carter," the officer said. "Please unlock the door." Michael slid the bolt back and opened the door just enough to confirm their identity. Two uniformed officers stood outside, their presence immediately easing the tension in the room. Zeus stepped forward, standing firmly between Michael and the officers, his posture protective but non-aggressive. The taller officer knelt slightly, his voice calm as he addressed the dog. "He's sharp. Former K9, right?" Michael nodded, his voice steady but tired. "Yes, he's my guide now, but he hasn't forgotten his training." The officer gave a small, approving nod. "Good to know. Can you tell us what happened?" Michael recounted the evening's events, the confrontation at the cafe, the motorcycles following him, and Chuck's escalating threats outside his apartment. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing grimmer as the story unfolded. "Did they try to break in?" the second officer asked, gesturing toward the window Zeus had guarded. Michael nodded. "I heard them trying to pry it open. Zeus scared them off before they could get in." The taller officer inspected the window, his flashlight cutting through the darkness outside. "There are fresh scratch marks here," he said, shining the beam along the frame. "Looks like they were trying to force it." The second officer turned to Michael. "We'll patrol the area and keep an eye out for them. But based on what you've described, it sounds like these guys are determined. Do you have somewhere else you can stay tonight?" Michael hesitated. He didn't want to abandon his home, but he also knew Zeus's instincts were rarely wrong. "I have a friend nearby," he said finally. "I can call them if things escalate again." The officers exchanged glances, then nodded. "That's a good idea. In the meantime, we'll make sure the area stays secure. If they come back, don't hesitate to call us immediately." Michael thanked them as they left, their patrol car lingering outside for a few minutes before driving off. The apartment fell silent again, save for the faint sound of Zeus's paws pacing the room. Michael crouched beside Zeus, running a hand through his fur. "You saved us tonight," he murmured, his voice filled with gratitude. "But I don't think this is over." Zeus looked up at him, his gaze steady and unyielding. The dog's resolve was clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Michael leaned back against the couch, exhaling deeply. The night wasn't finished, but with Zeus by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope that they could outlast whatever Chuck tried next. The night dragged on, its silence interrupted only by the faint sounds of distant traffic. Michael sat on his couch, his hands resting on Zeus's broad shoulders. The loyal dog, though still alert, had settled into a calmer stance, his breathing steady, but his eyes always darting to the door or the window. The police patrols had circled the block a couple of times since their visit, but Michael couldn't shake the lingering tension in his chest. "Maybe we should stay somewhere else tonight," Michael said aloud, though it felt more like he was thinking out loud than making a firm decision. Zeus tilted his head slightly at the sound of his voice, his ears twitching in response. Michael reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts, until he landed on his friend Linda's name. She was a close confidant, someone who had been there for him after his accident and had helped him adjust to life with Zeus. If there was anyone he could count on, it was her. The call connected after a few rings. "Michael," Linda's familiar voice came through, warm but tinged with concern. "It's late. Is everything okay?" Michael hesitated, not wanting to worry her, but he knew he needed support. "It's been a rough night," he admitted. "There was an incident at the cafe with a guy who followed me home. He's been persistent." "Persistent?" Linda repeated, her tone sharpening. "What do you mean?" Michael explained everything, the confrontation, the threats, and the police visit. He kept his voice calm, but recounting the events made the fear resurface. Linda didn't hesitate. "You're not staying there tonight," she said firmly. "Come over. You and Zeus will be safe here." Michael exhaled, relief washing over him. "Thanks, Linda. I'll grab a few things and head over." As he ended the call, Michael turned to Zeus. "Looks like we're spending the night with Linda," he said, his voice soft. Zeus responded with a gentle nudge to Michael's hand, as if affirming the decision. Packing a small overnight bag took only a few minutes. Michael relied on muscle memory to gather what he needed, his hands moving methodically through the apartment. Zeus stayed close, his presence grounding Michael as they prepared to leave. Just as Michael was about to step out, a distant rumble made him freeze. The unmistakable growl of a motorcycle engine cut through the quiet night, growing louder with every second. Zeus's ears perked up, his body tensing as he moved protectively in front of Michael. Michael clenched the leash in his hand, his grip tightening. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The engine stopped abruptly, its echo fading into silence. Michael's heart pounded as he strained to hear any movement outside. Zeus growled low, the sound barely audible, but filled with warning. Then came a voice, muffled but familiar. "Hey, blind guy. You in there?" "Chuck." Michael's blood ran cold. He hadn't expected the biker to return so soon, or at all. But here he was, his arrogance refusing to fade. Zeus barked sharply, his body coiled and ready. Michael reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911 once again. The operator's voice was calm, but Michael's own was tense as he explained the situation. "He's back," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "He's outside my apartment. We have officers nearby," the operator assured him. "They're on their way." As Michael hung up, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. "Zeus, stay," he said firmly, his voice commanding but calm. The German shepherd obeyed, though his eyes never left the door. Outside, Chuck's taunts continued. "What's the matter? Too scared to come out? Thought you and your mutt were tough." Michael didn't respond. He stood silently, his hand resting on Zeus's head as they waited. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension pressing down like a weight on his chest. Then, the sound of approaching sirens broke through the taunts. Chuck's voice faltered, and Michael could hear the scuffle of boots on pavement as the biker retreated. Moments later, there was a loud knock at the door. "Police." Michael opened the door cautiously, Zeus standing at his side. The officers stepped inside, their presence filling the apartment with a sense of relief. "We saw him take off," one of them said. "We'll catch him, Mr. Carter. He won't bother you again." Michael nodded, his grip on Zeus's leash relaxing slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. As the officers left to pursue Chuck, Michael turned back to Zeus. "Let's go to Linda's," he said softly. "You've done enough for one night." Zeus wagged his tail faintly, his tension easing for the first time in hours. Together, they stepped out into the cool night, leaving behind the shadows of the conflict, but not the lessons it had taught them. The cool night air wrapped around Michael and Zeus as they walked toward Linda's home. The rhythmic tap of Michael's cane against the pavement and the sound of Zeus's steady steps were the only noises accompanying them now. The streets were quiet, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Michael felt a glimmer of peace. When they arrived at Linda's house, the warm glow from the porch light greeted them like an old friend. Linda opened the door before Michael could knock, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Come in," she said quickly, ushering them inside. Zeus entered first, sniffing the air as if to ensure the space was safe. Michael followed, his shoulders relaxing slightly as the door closed behind them. Linda guided him to the couch, where he sank into the cushions with a tired sigh. "You look exhausted," Linda said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Do you want to talk about it?" Michael hesitated before nodding. "It's been a long day," he admitted. "That guy, he pushed things too far." Zeus held it together, but I could tell he knew we weren't safe. Linda knelt beside Zeus, running her fingers through his fur. "This dog is incredible," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "He's more than just your guide, isn't he?" Michael smiled faintly, his hand finding Zeus's head. "He's my guardian, my partner. I wouldn't have gotten through tonight without him." Linda looked up at Michael. "Do you think it's over? Will that man come back?" Michael shook his head. "The police are after him now. He knows they're watching, and Zeus made it clear he's not a dog to mess with. I think Chuck will think twice before trying anything again." Linda nodded, satisfied, but still cautious. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." "Thank you," Michael said, his voice full of gratitude. As the night wore on, the weight of the day's events began to lift. Zeus curled up at Michael's feet, his breathing steady and calm. Linda brought out a blanket, draping it over Michael as he rested on the couch. "You're safe here," she said gently. Michael nodded, his hand reaching down to rest on Zeus's side. "I know," he murmured. The room grew quiet, the warmth of the space enveloping them. As Michael drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of Zeus's unwavering loyalty and the bond they shared. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. The next morning, Michael awoke to the sound of Zeus's soft whine, a reminder of the constancy of his companion. He sat up, stretching, and smiled as he felt Zeus nuzzle his hand. "Another day? Huh, boy," Michael said. Zeus's tail thumped against the floor in response, a quiet affirmation that they were ready to move forward, stronger than ever.